Hello folks, my name is Sean McDonough. I'm a consultant with Bitstream Foundry here in Cincinnati, Ohio, and this is my favorite feature in Azure Active Directory. Before we dive into that though, I hope you're having a great virtual party, that you had a lot of fun with the different opportunities to you. And if you're coming to sessions or these lightning talks, you're probably a little worn out maybe from some VR, so let's move right along. So here's what I've got 15 minutes or less to actually cover. I'm going to talk about the Azure Application Proxy, what you need to use it, how the Azure Application Proxy works, what it can do, can't do for you, because there's quite a bit it can do. And we're actually going to go through a deployment and usage scenario that's near and dear to my heart. And finally, at the end, I've got references. A handful of them, but they provide a lot more in-depth analysis and documentation than we can do here in 15 minutes. So moving right along, let's meet the Azure Application Proxy. First of all, what is it and why do I like it so much? Well, at its core, the Azure App Proxy is a mechanism to publish applications that are internal to your organization. And this is primarily web applications. You can think of it as a sort of reverse proxy or a lightweight application gateway. In many cases, and in fact, a number of customers I've had, I've been able to replace or at least shift off of VPN usage. I've had customers who have been running jump boxes that they would log into and then jump from there to their internal destinations. You can actually get rid of a lot of that with clever use of the application proxy. The app proxy is inherently secure, which we will explore a little bit more later. And it can be made fault tolerant and redundant to improve scalability. There's a lot of documentation on how to do this and implement it securely. But by its very nature, the Azure App Proxy is secure, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So how does it actually work? Well, you go out to Azure, you download a connector. It'll install on a Windows server within your organization. This does not need to be the server that the application you want to publish is running on. It just needs to be a server that has a line of sight in network terms to your application and can get back outside. So it needs to be relatively unfettered as far as destination restrictions go. You then configure the application proxy with your Azure tenant credentials, and this is what allows the proxy to wire back up to Azure, which is one of its strengths. Then you just go in and you add and configure applications to share externally. And that's about it. Of course, the devil's in the details, right? Most of you know that already. But the nice thing about the app proxy is, in terms of security, nothing actually drills into your network. And that's a common misconception. All the connections from the app proxy actually originate inside your domain, and they're outbound in nature. So this provides a layer of security that you might otherwise not have if you're punching holes in your firewall to let applications through. So what do we need to actually use this? Well, unfortunately, there's no way to ease this. You need an Azure Active Directory Premium, either P1 or P2 subscription. Now this kind of bugs me. The Azure App Proxy has actually been around a long time, and it's one of Azure Active Directory's best kept secrets. But it used to only require an Azure AD Basic subscription. And that's what I did with my tenant years ago. I bought an Azure Basic Active Directory subscription. It was like $12 for the year. Microsoft is still billing me for that. I think I need to take that off my subscription. But the Basic subscription doesn't get you the app proxy anymore. So that's a bummer. It used to work. Some of the other requirements will make a little bit more sense. And these are around the requirements necessary to run that proxy, the app proxy that needs to be installed. The app proxy typically goes on a Windows Server 2012 R2 or Server 2016. It can be run on Server 2019. There are some specific instructions you need to follow out in Microsoft Docs to get things ready, just to make sure you're In fact, for all of them, it's all the server versions. It's a good idea to review these instructions because the App Proxy now uses TLS 1.2. I think Server 2012 R2 may not actually implement that by default, but in any case, there's more elaboration on these requirements if you go and look at the resources that I published. So how does this thing work? Well, this is a case where a diagram's worth 1,000 words. And I know this is a busy looking diagram, but if you'll bear with me for a second, I'll try and make sense of it. Here we go. So we've got our little laser pointer here. This, of course, is you. Now, if we have a published application, if we think about this as starting from scratch, step one is we get authenticated so that Azure knows who we are, and we end up getting a token back here in step two. Step three is the request to the external endpoint. This goes out to the App Proxy cloud service, which is an endpoint for our application proxy. Now remember the communications from the App Proxy within your domain, they are outbound initiated only. So that's why the language here says connector picks up request. The connector is on the inside of your organization. The cloud App Proxy is out here. That in order to initiate an outbound connection, we have to pick up the request. So it fetches it from connector to proxy, which at the same time we get it back. The connector requests an endpoint with the application server. This is based on how you publish the application within your organization. And so it makes a request. That, of course, goes to the proxy, the App Proxy, which then gets sent back out to the proxy cloud service, and you get your response back. So the Application Proxy is essentially a service that, for lack of a better way to put it, straddles your firewall in a secure fashion. It may actually be easier for us to take a look at this slightly differently. And this gets rid of all of the sequencing of numbers. And if you look at it, this is how things flow. Of course, the Application Proxy service doesn't actually drill into the connectors through the DMZ. The connection happens outbound. So it's still important to point out that we look at these connectors. The connection is initiated outbound. There's nothing penetrating your firewall or DMZ here. And the applications are published from within your organization and made available to users who want to get to them. So what can we and can't we do with this? Well, as a general rule, the Application Proxy does a solid job with web applications, APIs, and services that have a particular communication pattern. The App Proxy can connect on non-standard ports, so on ports other than 80 and 443, because this is primarily a web-based nature proxy. But it's also important that even if you use non-standard ports, your application cannot be transitioning ports during the operation, and there's some requirements on that. This is not an intelligent sort of adaptive firewall. The proxy will do URL rewrites and path rewrites, but it's pretty fixed in some of its operations. So this works best with apps, I say, that communicate consistently. That's, again, maintaining a certain port and pathing structure. But it's important to note that you do not need to have Microsoft apps, .NET-based apps, IIS apps, any of that to actually work for the Application Proxy to work. It's simply a publishing system. So although the default URL you get for published applications is a Microsoft URL, you can use, if you happen to have hosts and DNS, and you've got your own domain, you can set up SSL certificates and register your host names, and the App Proxy can use that. So it does not have to look like you're constantly going to a Microsoft endpoint. You can actually select something that is friendly to your organization. So there are many options for securing those published apps. I told you it's secure, and we have multiple ways to authenticate. And if you do not want to authenticate at the proxy level, you can just pass through and let the app decide. We'll see that here in a bit. Internal HTTP applications typically published externally with SSL, so you don't need to worry about setting things up inside your organization in a secure fashion. If you have an endpoint and you want to expose it, you just do it through the proxy. And then you can select groups and users who can access and use to publish applications. You don't have to, it's not everybody or no one. You can have application groups, users who can access those and be fairly granular in your ability to regulate who can see what. So there's an FAQ in the references section. That's got a lot of Q&A surrounding scenarios, a lot of good questions. It'll give you a pretty quick answer to some of the maybe somewhat obscure answers or questions you might ask about it. So let's go and do our demo. And I'm going to go ahead and publish my Plex server through the Azure Application Proxy. So let's go. So here we come out to our domain controller where I'm setting up the connector and going to the Azure portal. Once on the Azure portal, I go to Azure Active Directory. And upon selecting that, over on the left-hand side, I can find the application proxy entry, click it, and that will show me any configured application proxies I have already. Now, the application proxy that I want to use isn't set up yet, so I'm going to download the connector service. But to save a little bit of time, I've already downloaded it and am now running it on the second domain controller in my domain. Of course, I've got to give it admin rights to run. The proxy connector gets laid down, and then it asks me for my credentials. And this is how the application proxy connector knows how to connect back to Azure and go into my tenant. So at this point, the connector is running, or will be very shortly, on my domain controller, and it has connectivity to my Azure tenant. So if I go back here and do a hard refresh, I should see another entry in my list of connectors. And in fact, I do. This MOVDC is the one I just installed. So from this point, I've got the connector live. I need to create an application. And like I said, we're going to publish Plex. I know that this is on my media server called mo-v-media1. And the Plex web app is running on port 32,400. I changed pre-authentication to pass-through because I do not want to be authenticated at the level of the proxy. I want Plex to do it itself. So I copy that URL. Now notice there are other parameters I can change, including backend application timeout and all sorts of other things. When I'm satisfied with the configuration, I click Add, and very shortly thereafter, I get my application. So let's go out and try and connect to this through Azure Web Proxy. And you'll notice I'm going to my web proxy, and it's going to run like a charm. So I supply my Plex credentials because we chose to do pass-through security, so it needs to know who I am. And notice the URL. We're still plex-bitstreamfoundry.msappproxy.net. And this is running out of my what I call my basement data center. And this is the Plex web interface. So all my movies and television shows, videos, things like that are out here. Let's pick one. Let's say you like Peter Wayland of the Aliens series of movies. Peter Wayland eventually went on to cede his company to Yutani Corporation, Wayland Yutani. This is a fake TED Talk that came out before Prometheus. So here are some references that I made mention of during the presentation. And if you want to get in touch with me, again, my name is Sean McDonough. I've got a blog. I've got several different pages. I'm a lover of all things donut, and anyone who knows me knows that. You can get me on LinkedIn, Twitter as well. Send me an email if you want. But I hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned something about it.